In 54 AD, a young 16-year-old boy named Nero was declared the Emperor of Rome. His tutor, the famous philosopher Seneca, had prepared a speech to give before the Senate. Nero promised to uphold the rights of the Senate, and to rule as Augustus Caesar had originally intended. While this promising young boy impressed the Senate, none had any idea that he would plunge the empire into the worst years of famine, plague, bloodshed, and turmoil, leaving millions of dead over the ensuing decades. We're going to take a deep dive into the mysterious and terrifying visions of the Four Horsemen of the Book of Revelation and their uncanny resemblance to the emperors in the lead up to Nero. As John said to his original audience, these are the things that must soon take place. Blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written, for the time is near. And how near was it? John says, every eye will see Christ, even those who pierced him. The book was intended to be relevant to the original generation who saw the Lord Jesus, especially, he says, to those who pierced him. Jesus said that the generation would not pass away, and so we should expect the Four Horsemen to come soon in the first century. But how soon? In Revelation 5, we see the vision of Christ having been slain and ransoming a people for God. He is presented to God the Father, which we can immediately recognize as the ascension of Christ. This must mean that Revelation 6 occurs after the ascension. We're going to look at the 4 Roman emperors from 30 AD onwards and see if they fit the symbols that are represented in the Four Horsemen. Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering, and to conquer. The first horseman is identified by his white horse, a bow, and a conqueror's crown, or more accurately, the Stephanos, the victor's laurel wreath. If the ascension is described in the 5th chapter of Revelation, then the expectation is that this horseman would be expected around the same date. No candidate fits better than the second Roman emperor, Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus. He was one of Rome's greatest generals during the reign of the first emperor Augustus. Much of Augustus's success was attributed to the conquests of Tiberius. He was given the Stephanos, the victor's laurel wreath, by him while he was still a conquering general. Unlike the other emperors, they took the diadem crown, whereas Tiberius kept his laurel wreath even while emperor. He was quite superstitious, believing that as long as he wore it, he would be kept safe from lightning. If first century Christians pulled up a coin of Tiberius, he is depicted on all these coins as wearing the laurel wreath. Coins were the means by which the emperors would be able to communicate their symbols to the Roman population, and it's no coincidence then that Revelation would depict these horsemen with these symbols. And let's look at 2 prominent Tiberian coins. The first coin depicts Tiberius wearing a laurel wreath on one side, and with his mother Livia depicted as the goddess Pax, or peace, holding a scepter, crown, and under her feet what appears to be a bow. She is associated with the color white and symbolizes the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. The second major coin was the goddess Victoria, the Roman equivalent to Nike, and she is carrying a laurel wreath. This is interesting because the Greek word to conquer here, Nikon, or victory, is derived from the god Nike in Greek. Verse 2 tells us that Tiberius went out conquering, that is, in order that he might conquer. This language is very awkward. It carries the meaning that he came out intending to conquer, but he wouldn't be able to achieve it. And this was true for Tiberius. His earlier victories against the Cantabrians and the Parthian Empire began to be overshadowed by his many years of struggling against the Gauls, Germans, and Illyrians. Towards the end of his reign, he grew strongly out of favor with the people. Suetonius records horrific abuses, pederasty, masochism, cruelty, and vile behavior. When he died at 78, the people erupted in celebrations. The Senate did not give the emperor the rightful divine honors, and the crowds called out to the Tiber with Tiberius, referring to a tradition of disposing criminals by throwing them into the Tiber River. And while the people of Rome were celebrating the end of one tyrant, they had no idea that the next horseman would make the excesses of Tiberius seem like child's play. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. The next man to ascend to the throne was the Emperor Caligula, and he was welcomed with great enthusiasm. Over the next 3 months of celebration, they sacrificed over 160,000 animals. People hailed Caligula as their star and their savior. Despite his overwhelming support for the people, he began to drench the palaces of Rome with blood. He immediately killed his co-heir, Gemellus. He murdered members of his own family with the sword, including his adopted son, his grandmother, father-in-law, and brother-in-law. While Tiberius was a hoarder, amassing an impressive wealth of 3 billion sesterces, Caligula began to spend like wild. He lavished money on the Praetorian Guard, his soldiers, and the people. He set up huge gladiatorial matches, boxing matches, and circuses. He was well loved at the beginning of his reign, but within 2 years he was flat broke. So in order to maintain his reckless spending, he began to execute some of the wealthy men of Rome and confiscate their estates. He borrowed huge sums of money, levying taxes on all manner of things, even including prostitution. The peace of the first horseman, Tiberius, was now taken away. The reign of Caligula was best described as bloodshed. Caligula kept 2 books, one named The Sword and the other called The Dagger, both of which contained countless names of those he wanted to kill. He was known for carrying a sword around everywhere, threatening his lovers with beheadings. He would choose nobles to fight to death in the Colosseum. He even had all of his bald prisoners serve as meals for the beasts of his zoo. He became the first emperor of Rome to demand worship as a god while he was still alive. And Revelation tells us that this horseman was not afraid to cause bloodshed. For instance, when Ptolemy, the king of Mauritania, was invited to Rome, many people declared their admiration for his toga. This made Caligula so jealous that he immediately executed Ptolemy, which politically spiraled into the province of Mauritania revolting. He directed his officials to place statues of himself in the Jewish synagogues and in the temple, which came close to setting off a war. Revelation says that the second horseman received a giant sword. Now the word Machaira refers to the Roman gladius, which by no means is a big sword. It seems a bit of an oxymoron to call it that way. Rather, the sword is speaking figuratively of the power of the state to punish. Caligula, as emperor, was granted unprecedented powers to kill and execute whom he willed. But what about the colour red? Caligula is strongly associated with the colour red. Caligula's coins became associated with the goddess Vesta, who is depicted in red and is the guard of the sacred flame. Elsewhere, he is depicted with the Pegasus, which during his reign was red. You see many different mosaics, frescoes, vases and artworks of Pegasus from this period. And, of course, he is also famous for making his favourite horse a senator and draping him in red robes. When Caligula was finally put to the sword by a palace guard, the people of Rome rejoiced, but their trials were far from over, for another horseman was coming. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in its hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." Caligula was now assassinated in a pool of blood at the age of 28, and in the chaos, a terrified Claudius hid himself in the curtains of the palace. He was certain that he was next, as the Senate was now seeking to exterminate the entire royal lineage. However, when the guards found him, they put him in safe custody and convinced the Senate to make Claudius their next emperor. Claudius was crowned by King Herod II, the king of Judea, with his brother Agrippa. He was even minted on a coin. What we begin to see with Claudius is the growing influence and control that the province of Judea began to exert over Rome. Claudius knew that he was in a precarious political position, so he pardoned the assassinators of his nephew Caligula and gave powers back to the Senate. He allowed them to debate his decrees in the Senate, and he would always ensure to give them a hearing. What Claudius became known for was the bureaucratization of the Roman Empire. He greatly expanded control over trade and commodities, especially the sale, subsidization, and distribution of grains. He championed infrastructure projects such as new arenas, aqueducts, highways, and irrigation systems. He tried to distance himself from the divine claims of his predecessors and became connected with the Black Horse. Dr. Phil Kaiser says, quote, "The Black Horse, though beautiful, was considered more conservative than the white horses of Augustus and Tiberius. Prior to Julius Caesar, Roman generals didn't use them because those white horses were symbols of the god Apollo and went with the Caesar's claim to deity. Claudius avoided all claims to deity and wanted to appear as conservative to the Senate." End quote. Yet all his interference in the Roman economy served to create an economic disaster. His disaster was to do with the price of grain. During the reign of Claudius, there was a great famine all over the world. In fact, you can read about it in Acts 11:28. "And one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. This took place in the days of Claudius." Claudius tried to fix this disaster by managing his way out of it. This is very interesting then that the third horseman is depicted as holding a pair of scales, because this is the way that Claudius marketed himself to the people through his minted coins. Here we have a coin with a hand holding the scale. The first time this ever appeared on an emperor's coin. He also minted a coin with a modius, which is a measurement of grain which equals 8 koinics. The Greek word koinics is translated as quart in our passage here. And despite his desire to be seen as a skilled administrator, there were numerous devastating famines that ripped through the empire. The price of grain became 12 times as expensive, which devastated the plebeian class. John is given a vision of 1 koinix, or a quart, to a denarii, which is equivalent for 1 day's ration to 1 day's labour. In Roman terms, that was 32 sesterces to a modius. And that's not even the highest price it got around the empire. In Erythrae, it reached a price of 40 sesterces to modius. Barley was considered the cheap alternative to wheat, but even barley was becoming inaccessible to the plebeians. Tacitus records a moment when Claudius was almost killed by an angry mob. Quote, "Scanty crops too, and consequent famine were regarded as a token of calamity, nor were there merely whispered complaints. While Claudius was administering justice, the populace crowded round him in a boisterous clamour and drove him into the corner of the forum, where they violently pressed on him till he broke through the furious mob with a body of soldiers." End quote. In order to appease the mob, Claudius began to redistribute grain. He even started welfare programs, handing out free grain to the poor. He rebuilt a port in Ostia to accommodate more grain imports. But with 30,000 workers diverted from the local farms, it served to make the situation worse. He subsidized trade, but it inflated the price further. He offered insurance against shipwreck for those traders who did deliver grain, even offering them Roman citizenship if they did it for 6 years. And yet all of his fixes served to exacerbate the problem. This had become an empire-wide disaster, just as the book of Revelation describes. This would have been immediately recognizable to John's audience, as this was still quite recent for his audience. But this was something they had already experienced. The next horseman was immediately relevant, for he was the horseman ruling when the book of Revelation came into the lap of the church. When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. The next Roman Empire to ascend to the throne was the infamous Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, all better known as Nero. Now the horse he's riding is called a green horse, in Greek, chloros, which is where we get the word chlorophyll. It's described here in the ESV as a pale horse, probably because there are no such things as a green horse. Yet all throughout the Bible this is the word to describe green grass. Even later in Revelation 9:4 we see it referring to green grass. There is a reason the horse is green. Nero had his silver coins minted with copper in an attempt to save money. However, this backfired as the coins all turned green, and it greatly inflated the coins minted by Nero. If the Christians of the 1st century had reached into their pockets, they would have pulled out the green coin of the Emperor Nero. And what was on the other side of the coin? The god Hades abducting Persephone, the goddess of death, on a green horse. This vile story of the violation of the virgin Persephone captivated the corrupt mind of the Emperor Nero. Often this coin appeared with the portraits of his cruel mother Agrippina, who was the niece of the former Emperor Claudius, just as Persephone was the niece of Hades. Nero was obsessed with the imagery of death. He decorated his coins with the Gorgon, the monster of death, and according to the Aeneid, it stands at the entrance to the underworld. Early in his reign as a teenager, Nero would prowl the streets of Rome, with some young thugs seeking people to rob and women to rape, just as Hades kidnapped and raped Persephone. He was a murderer, molester, transvestite, sodomite, and pedophile. He killed his mother, his tutors, and he kicked his pregnant wife to death, marrying a young boy named Sporus who apparently looked exactly like her. Later, he also dressed up as a bride and married a man named Pythagoras. Now the fourth horseman is marked by their authority over a fourth of the earth, to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by wild beasts of the earth. During the reign of Nero, the empire was plunged into brutal and bloody wars. The famous Britannic queen Boudica led a bloody revolt leading to the deaths of 70 to 80,000 Romans and many more Britons. The Roman-Parthian War kicked off for 5 years between 58 and 63 AD, leaving many tens of thousands dead. Most infamously, and the focus it seems of the book of Revelation, is the Roman-Jewish War of 66 to 73 AD. The reign of Nero was marked by significant bloodshed. This wasn't just at the end of the sword in war. Another great famine ravaged Rome in 67 AD. Many died in the plagues that struck in 61 AD in the province of Asia Minor. There were hurricanes, pestilences, and natural disasters. The autumn plague of 65 AD killed 30,000 people alone, and the earthquake that occurred in 66 AD killed many more and left some cities destroyed and deserted. Fires engulfed and almost destroyed the city of Rome in 64 AD, which Nero promptly blamed on Christians, which began one of the worst persecutions of the church. But Nero is most famously associated with death by wild animals. During his reign of terror, he threw many Christians to the lions, dogs, and wild animals of the Colosseum. He would even dress up as a wild animal, and he would eat the flesh of his torture victims. No one embodies the fourth horseman with more rigor than the Emperor Nero. With 3 more seals left to be opened, the Roman Empire is set to descend into more chaos and tribulation at the hands of these maniacal rulers. Yet the message of Revelation is one of hope. For John's audience, this old age is passing away, and a new age has come upon the world, marked by the justice and judgment of the true King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ. This Revelation project would not have started without the tireless research and biblical exegesis of Dr. Philip Kaiser. You can check out over 115 sermons on the book of Revelation on his website, revelation.biblicalblueprints.com. Included is audio, transcripts, timelines, and interactive textual structure, dating clues, and many vital applications to today.